Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you very much for yesterday, for singing, in particular to you, Kristalina. You were a lead singer, and I can tell you, it should be in your CV, that you also sing so well. Ali, thanks for being with us second time, but last time we saw was in Luxembourg at the panel, at the EIB conference. So I saw here again. So it comes again. So, dear Minister, Prime Minister Andrej Plenković, dear Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, dear ministers, fellow governors, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to everyone. After yesterday's nice evening, it's good to see you ready to start the conference. As you know, the conference is co-organized by the International Monetary Fund and the Croatian National Bank since 2017. It started when Christine Lagarde was the MD, and we are now working together. She's now my boss in the Governing Council of the ECB. When we started the conference, none of us had an idea that we would be working 6 years later, or actually no, it's now 9 years later, 6 years later in the Governing Council. That much about the predictability. And I'm happy now to continue this cooperation with Kristalina and staff, particularly in the European Department. I would first like to thank our colleagues from the IMF for the great cooperation in preparing this conference, and we are happy to have been able to gather all of you here today, top policymakers and the great speakers that will talk about the topical issues throughout the day. My special welcome goes to the IMF's Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. It is our great pleasure to host you for the first time in Dubrovnik, although not in Croatia. You've been to Croatia a number of times, but first time here. And of course, my thanks go to the Prime Minister Plenković for being with us today to open the conference and set the stage for the discussions that will follow. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming to Dubrovnik and being here to share your knowledge and experience with us. Last time we gathered, as Ali has said, was in 2019. So we had the first conference in 2017, 2019, 2021. We had to skip for the known reason, pandemics. And if you go back to 2020, 2021, Kristalina and me, we discussed it yesterday, how today already we forgot how it was in 2020. When we go back to the spring of 2020, I think very few of us would have believed that we would be today here in the shape that we are. We recovered much better than anyone expected in 2020, including the IMF. If you go back and look at the forecasts, spring meetings, 2020, and if you look where we are today, we did much, much better than anybody at that time expected. And that's great. That's about the adaptability, resilience, and what we've learned how to fight with the crisis like the pandemics. In 4 years since the last meeting, we were hit not only by the pandemics, but we were also hit by the war in Europe, the war that also nobody in 2019 could have thought could happen in Europe. Major war on the European soil. We saw as a consequence of all that, pandemics, supply chain disruptions, war in Ukraine, surge in the inflation to the levels that none of us in 2019, and some of you were here in 2019, nobody could have thought about. We are now having the interest rates at the level that none of us central bankers in 2019, when we last met here, could have imagined we would have today when we meet again in Dubrovnik. So the world has changed so much in only 4 years that in a world of us, economists, central bankers, it looks like a decade. And it's been only 4 years when you go back. We tend to forget, as we discussed yesterday. It looks like a distant past. It's not a distant past. It was 4 years ago. World looked very, very different. And this is something which I think we should talk about today at this conference. As we always say, as an economist, don't waste a good crisis. Learn something from the crisis. So I think that it's a good opportunity now, 4 years later, with a very different world, to say, what did we learn over the last 4 years? And I want to say that there are 3 things that I think we should learn. And this is the resilience, it's the adaptability, and it's the cooperation. So first on resilience. We live in an obviously shock-prone world in which unpredictability has become a norm. We could not predict what happened over the last 3-4 years, so maybe we cannot predict what will happen in the next 3 or 4 years. If you only look at the geopolitical situation today, next 3 years looks more unpredictable now than the world looked in 2019 when we last met here. And in times of such unpredictability, in this environment, I think that the resilience building becomes a priority both for businesses and for the governments. So we should focus on the resilience. And the resilience entails 2 elements: preventing the buildup of vulnerabilities and preparing to absorb shocks when they occur. If you have not done the first properly, then the second one becomes much more difficult. On prevention, a lot has been done over the past few decades. We are constantly developing new indicators, tools, and instruments to address potential vulnerabilities. Fund, for example, us as the central bankers. But as we very well know, no crisis is the same. Each and every one is different than the previous one. That's why they are so difficult to predict, and that's why they are so difficult to deal with when they happen. So on top of the prevention, we also need to work on our absorption capacity when a crisis happens. Pandemics has proven that only a swift and massive policy action can mitigate the economic effects of such a huge external shock. But the ability to act, the limits of the policy action are the available fiscal space. So in a way, we have to prepare now, build the fiscal space. This is what central bankers always tell the ministers of finance. We have to build the fiscal space to be able to react to the next crisis. We don't know when it's going to happen, what kind of a crisis it will be. But we have to build this resilience right now, because in some way it will happen. On our first 2 panels today, we'll have a chance to talk about building resilience. and dealing with the crisis, particularly in the energy sector and the supply chains. More broadly, in addition to prevention and mitigation policies for building resilience, it is also essential, as we also learned over the last few years, to build a trust in governance, institutions, and data. This is because the effective crisis response depends on public acceptance and adherence to necessary policy measures. If people don't believe the institutions, if they don't believe the government, if they don't believe the central bank, if they don't believe the other institutions, it's much more difficult to respond to the crisis. So this is why we have to build the trust in the institutions. And higher is the trust in the institution, easier we will deal with the next crisis. And institutions themselves build credibility in the times of the crisis. That's when people see whether the institutions can deal with them or not. And the good message is we did it well over the last crisis. Second lesson I think we should take from last 4 years since we met is the adaptability. Adaptability and resilience, they are linked, but they're also different in important ways. Resilience entails enduring a challenge, but adaptability refers to the ability to thrive beyond it. In the European Union, progress on that front, I think, is evident. I think we did very well in the European Union because we have been moving from the reactive policies to strategic decision-making. The recent crisis brought some important institutional changes. The early months of the pandemic led to the establishment of the EU Recovery Fund, which constituted a breakthrough for the financial solidarity of member states. And this is a great for Europe. The Next Generation EU package provides an anchor for investment in the green and digital transitions in a way that will support resilience and adaptability along the way in the future. And finally, the REPower EU plan aims to end dependence on Russian fossil fuels, but also entails measures for energy saving, new energy storage rules, and strategy to buy energy together. Which brings me to a final lesson. Together means a cooperation. So we have to do things together. We must be, I think we should be careful actually not to try to do things in the interconnected world separately. We should, in any possible way, in spite of any geostrategic interests or geopolitical tensions, try to cooperate as much as possible, because the challenges ahead of us, many of them are not national, are international, global. And if we don't take together, we'll have difficulty in tackling them. So some of the initiatives during the pandemic demonstrated willingness for increased global cooperation and solidarity. For example, the IMF's emergency financing, the debt relief initiatives, and the SDR allocation. The more recent trade and investment fragmentation trends, however, put in jeopardy global policy coordination efforts. And while business strategies like the nearshoring and friendshoring, of which we will speak in this conference, may be justified by the security motives of some countries, government inward-oriented policies can be costly, distortionary, or of limited efficiency. That's what we as economists can always tell. As an alternative, we should think of more ways to improve international cooperation, not impede it. Climate change mitigation and adaptation of sustainable development goals are examples of good global public goods where governments can achieve important economic and social goals through global cooperation, but can also easily fail without it. Now, when talking about the lessons from recent past, let me, in the end, for a moment, go further back in history and use the opportunity of being here in Dubrovnik and there is a mayor and head of the county here with us, to draw some parallels with the medieval Republic of Ragusa, which was the name of the city-state of Dubrovnik. History of old Ragusa was also not immune to the external shocks, such as wars, natural disasters, earthquakes in Dubrovnik, trade interruptions, and epidemics. In fact, in the medieval times, the dangers were far more serious than those we are facing today. In addition to conflicts, there was a constant threat of food shortages and diseases. So, as the title here says, navigating in the choppy waters was exactly what the policymakers in the old Ragusa were doing so successfully for centuries, both literally and metaphorically. Literally, by rightly recognizing, for example, shipbuilding as a strategic industry, and here they subsidized shipbuilding in Ragusa for centuries, very successfully. In Yugoslavia, we didn't do it successfully. In Croatia, we didn't do it so successfully, but these guys, for centuries, subsidized the strategic industry and did very well doing that. So they became one of the most prominent shipbuilders of the time, not only traders, together with Venice. And they were also very skillful in navigating their independence. In spite of the limited natural resources, there were no natural resources here, and they had practically no military power. There was a very little military power in Dubrovnik. And they were surrounded on one side by the Ottomans, quite an impressive power at that time, which occupied these areas for 400 years, and on the other by their long-time competitors, Venetians, which were doing the same, trade and the shipbuilding. How did they achieve that? Through resilience, adaptability, and the cooperation. In that time, in the medieval Europe, trade interruptions were frequent, so what the Dubrovnik tried to do was to contain the risks from food shortages by maintaining large reserves of grain and other commodities. That was building resilience at that time. Furthermore, they were the global front runners, as I said yesterday, and as we learned when we were in Lazareti, in implementing disease prevention measures, including setting up the first world quarantine, where we had a concert yesterday. They started in 14th century and continued with the quarantine measures. And finally, they realized that wise government policies in the field of public education, health, and social welfare were instrumental in preventing social unrest in the context of frequent external shock. At the same time, historical evidence suggests that Ragusa practiced also very prudent policy with respect to state finances, minting of currency, and good business-friendly, I look here at the representative of the business sector, business-friendly regulations. As for cooperation, Dubrovnik's military expenditures were minimal because they insisted on diplomatic efforts and negotiating skills. The historian Berkovic documented Dubrovnik entered into numerous international political and trade relations and was able to utilize this wisely and skillfully in the defense of its independence, sovereignty, and economic growth. And as a central banker, I have to finish with that, as a central banker of the bank that just adopted the euro 5 months ago, I must say that this is not the first time we have a hard currency in this country. In Dubrovnik, since 14th century, they had so-called zeka, or the mint, that was minting the currency until the 19th century, which was very well appreciated, more than the Florentine lira, less than the Venetian ducats. There's a Dubrovnik Grosso. Basically from 14th until 19th century, we had a very hard currency here. So I'm happy that we have it again, and it's the European one. It's not the Dubrovnik small city-state one, but we have that history already here. So to conclude, I think that Dubrovnik, the place where we have a conference, presents a good historical lesson on how to build a resilience, how to be adaptable, and build a cooperation. And I think this is very inspirational for our discussions that we will have today. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thank again to IMF and Kristalina. So please, the floor is yours, Kristalina.